Good afternoon. We have at least one of our guests online. We are going to go ahead and get started to honor um, those that are logged in at exactly at noon. Good afternoon. I am Silvia Rodriguez, president of the Hornets Policy and Politics Alumni Chapter. Today, I welcome you to part one of the HPPA's Lunch and Learn Budget Series, where you will hear from our distinct guests, Monica Davalos and Mauricio Torres, from the California Budget and Policy Center. Just really quick, this Lunch and Learn is going to be more like webinar style. If you have, we're going to have time for questions and answers, and I urge you to use the Q&A function. And thank you so very much for that. And the secretary of the HPPA is going to help with the questions that come in on behalf of Monica and Mauricio so that they can focus on their presentation. I also would love to give a shout out to Brad, who is our director at large, and Caleb Danielson, who is our events director. Thank you so much for helping us do this lunch and learn. This Lunch and Learn Part 1 with the California Budget and Policy Center is going to be recorded. And our standard operating procedure is to then follow the presentation with an email providing you with the link of the video and also provide you with the slides. So without further ado, just one more thing. I am not going to read our guest's bio. This is just to give you all more time to hear from the presentation. But instead, I urge you to go to the California Budget and Policy Center. Their bios are there. And also, you can find them on LinkedIn. So thank you, Mauricio. Thank you, Monica. Without further ado, I give you the space to do your magic. Thank you so much.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Silvia, for the introduction. So today, my colleague Monica Davalos and I will be giving an overview of the California state budget. But first, let me start by talking a little bit about who we are and where we're from. So the California Budget and Policy Center is a nonpartisan research and analysis nonprofit advancing public policies that expand opportunities and promote well-being for all Californians. In a nutshell, what we do is provide research and analysis to policymakers and their staff, advocates, the media, community groups, to make sure that our perspective and the data on Californians with low and middle incomes are at the front and center of decisions that policymakers are making day in and day out at the Capitol. So in today's presentation, we'll highlight the purpose of the state budget, share our key takeaway on the governor's proposal, review the state and federal context that is at the backdrop of all the decisions policymakers are making right now, describe key elements of the governor's plan, and then preview what to expect next in the budget process. So why the state budget matters, why we do the work that we do. So the state budget is more than dollars and cents. It reflects the priorities that policymakers have. Can you advance the slide, Monica? So budgets are statements of our values and priorities. And this is true at every level, both at the federal and state government, but then also locally for county, cities, and even institutions like university budgets. Where we spend our dollars really show where our values and priorities lie. So now I'm going to dive into some key state and federal context. We'll go ahead and start with the state context. So the state context is dire, and this is before any of the cuts from HR 1. So more than 1 in 5 Californians are currently experiencing poverty. That's about 7 million Californians. And we know that the state is facing widening inequality. The governor's administration expects a weaker job market in the state, and unemployment is expected to rise from 5.4 to 5.6%. Um, but even more alarming is the gap between the growth in workers' earnings and corporate profits, which has soared in the last 20 years. And we have a chart on the next slide. So when you look at this, this is a period from 2002 to 2022, and you can see that orange line, how much corporate profits have soared. That's 133%. And then Californian median earnings only grew by 8%. Um, and during this 20-year period, we have now seen, well, we saw one set of significant tax breaks for corporations in 2017 during the first Trump administration. And then since this chart to now, we have also seen another set of federal tax cuts for corporations. So this is the context that we're operating in. And then within this, we have to remember that racial discrimination in housing, education, taxation, in every facet of life makes inequality higher for communities of color across the state. And I know the state context was stark, but the federal context is probably worse. So HR 1, the harmful Republican mega bill, officially known as the big beautiful bill, but there's nothing beautiful about it, guts Medi-Cal and CalFresh to fund tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. As you can see on this slide, that is over $1 trillion in cuts to healthcare and food assistance. And you can see the tax cuts that went in for people making incomes over $500,000. And those cuts have a real impact. For healthcare in particular, we anticipate the state is going to lose about $30 billion in federal funds each year, which could leave 2 million Californians without healthcare coverage. And in food assistance, 3 million households are at risk of losing all of their food benefits or having them be significantly reduced. And just to reiterate the scale of the magnitude of the federal cuts on the state budget, federal funds make up over 1/3 of California's state budget in a normal budget year. So the cuts that we saw in HR 1 started to go into effect late last year, but will be going into effect on a rolling basis for the next several years. So we anticipate that the pie here of federal funds will start to dwindle, and we'll be talking about what solutions the state has to make up for that later in the presentation. So every January, the governor puts out their proposed budget. So this January, Governor Newsom released his proposed spending plan for the 2026-2027 spending year in light of this state and federal context that I just covered. So I'll go ahead and talk about our takeaway of the governor's proposal. Bottom line, the governor's proposal failed to meet the moment. Amid the rising affordability pressures, widening inequality, and all the cuts in HR 1, the governor's plan fails to use the tools available to protect Californians from inequality, poverty, and federal threats. While the governor generally maintained existing services for this year, his plan targets immigrants and for additional state cuts and protects billions of dollars in costly tax breaks for corporations, even though they just received massive federal tax cuts. So we know that California can and must do better, and we'll talk about how later in the presentation. So now I'll pass it over to Monica.
Yeah, thanks, Mauricio. So I will be providing kind of the bigger picture overview of what exactly was in the governor's proposed budget. And one thing to note, though, that this is just the proposed budget. There are various iterations and steps through our state budget process. And currently, the legislature is undergoing budget hearings to try to determine their priorities. So they eventually reconcile with the governor come May and come June when the final budget is enacted to know what actually ends up. So what we're going through today is just a proposal. It's not set in stone, but it is important to note that the governor does have a large sway and a lot of power of what actually ends up in our state budget, which is why it's really critical to know what's in his proposed budget in the first place. And then one thing to note, similar to most years with our California state budget, most of our state dollars and our expenditures go directly to supporting health and human services or education in California. In fact, 3 in 4 of our state dollars go directly to supporting health and human services, K through 12 education, or higher education. And that was true again in this year's proposed budget. You can see the kind of the percentage breakdown of like other issue areas and kind of the larger aggregate categories there. But the other thing to note, right? So we have this money to allocate and to spend. The bigger question then comes, right? So where does California get our revenues from in order to administer them to our various public services? And most of our state revenues in the governor's budget comes from 3 main sources. And that's our personal income tax. California does have a progressive tax structure, which means that we call on the lowest income Californians to pay proportionally less of their income than we do to very wealthy and high earning Californians. And we ask them to pay a little bit more of their income in personal income taxes. And then we also have sales and use taxes, as well as our state corporate tax, which comprise the 3 main revenue sources of our state budget. And so in the governor's proposed spending plan, it has 3 main assumptions. One, it actually assumes pretty strong revenue growth over what we call the budget window, which is this fiscal year and the last 2 fiscal years because of how our state budgeting works. And in this proposed budget, we actually have a relatively small and manageable deficit that the governor is anticipating. And we also anticipate to grow our state reserves or state savings accounts for future use. In terms of substantial revenue growth in California, this was actually something surprising that we saw come out of the governor's proposed budget, as over our general fund revenue, the administration states that it was about $42 billion higher across our 3-year budget window than was assumed last June. And that's a huge jump than what we were anticipating and were even hearing at the end of last year. And that was compared to the legislative analyst's office projection. And so the LAO, as they're called, they work directly for the legislature. And they modeled a way smaller number of how much revenues California would have to spend. But the main difference there is like how they modeled their estimates, and also the fact that the governor's office didn't really account for a major economic downturn. And so that's why we're seeing how we have potentially having higher revenues than when we anticipated. And also that the strong stock market that we currently were previously seeing, is a major reason for the positive near-term revenue. And in terms of the deficit, the governor is projecting California will have a deficit of just about $3 million. And this is largely due to our very positive revenue forecast. And granted, to you and me, $3 billion is a lot of money. But in the grand scheme of our state budget, which this proposed budget in total was over $500 billion, it's really a drop in the bucket and something that is manageable for our state leaders to manage. But again, current estimates aren't the final word. Revenues are notoriously volatile and hard to predict, but it's something that happens year after year. And it is something that this is why our state budget goes through various iterations, and the legislature has at their disposal various ways to make our budget pencil out because of the volatility within our revenues. The governor also projects over $20 billion in our reserves or state funding or state savings accounts through various accounts in order to build them up for different things in the future if we do continue to face budget shortfalls in the near future. What we did want to point out, though, as Mauricio briefly mentioned, is that the governor does fail to call for equitable revenue solutions that can mitigate a lot of the federal cuts that are coming to California this year and, quite frankly, in the near future. We know that there's severe harmful federal ramifications from HR1, but also from other federal actions, such as through our federal budget process and also federal regulatory efforts that are happening that are threatening to take away housing, food assistance, childcare, and much more from Californians in the near future. And really, we really know that new revenue is really essential to protecting the harmful federal cuts, because we still have a ton of corporate tax loopholes through our state budget that disproportionately benefit large corporations. And it's really a missed opportunity, right? There is more that state policymakers can do now in order to try to prevent some of this, but that is something that was not reflected in the governor's proposal. In terms of health, there's a lot in terms of health, but as mentioned, one of the main things that we do see in this year's proposed budget is that health policy cuts continue to target immigrants, even though we don't have to as a state. And in last year's budget, state leaders already restricted certain immigrants' access to healthcare, including by freezing Medi-Cal enrollment for undocumented Californians starting this year. And so these are the same group of folks that we know are being targeted and racially profiled by the federal government and various administration and various actors within the administration. And on top of that, we see the state adding more restrictive measures for these same Californians. And then Newsom actually goes a little bit further by proposing further rollbacks, such as imposing work requirements on undocumented Californians who receive Medi-Cal, a change that is not required by HR1. But they're doing that as a willful policy choice in California, even though we know that work requirements and other requirements are really designed to kick people off of their coverage, just as other Californians are going to lose their coverage because of these federal restrictions that are being imposed. It also denies a state-funded Medi-Cal to immigrant populations that are going to lose their coverage due to HR1, and that's a variety of folks, including, I believe, including refugees and certain folks fleeing unsafe circumstances. They are going to lose their healthcare coverage, and the state is choosing not to backfill and cover those Californians. And now I'll turn it over to Mauricio to go over economic security.
Awesome. Thanks, Monica. Some not so great news in economic security as well. So reiterating a similar theme that you've heard from both of us already, Newsom made no real plan to address the federal threats and cuts to several programs that relate to economic security. The governor proposed to only make the minimum required investments in CalFresh. And this is pretty problematic because HR1 increased the share of administrative cost that the state has to pay for CalFresh. And the way that the governor's administration is trying to address this is by shifting nearly $150 million of those costs onto counties who we know already have pretty stretched local budgets and have very limited tools in how to raise funds to help cover those costs. The proposal maintains a commitment to universal school meals, but fails to help those who are at risk of losing CalFresh by not planning for the harsh implementation of new time limits. Because of these new time limits from HR1, we particularly see older adults, caretakers, veterans, former foster youth, and people experiencing homelessness to be impacted by these new time limits. And then lastly, the governor does not expand the California Food Assistance Program, which is the state-funded version of CalFresh, to a set of newly excluded immigrants. So that is about 74,000 humanitarian immigrants who will likely lose CalFresh because of new federal laws. And it would be great for the state to step in and have them be eligible for the CFAP, the California Food Assistance Program, but that is not included in the current proposal. In other places, the governor largely maintains the safety net, but that's like keeping the status quo. As you saw at the start, 1 in 5 Californians are facing poverty, and one way to do that is one way to help Californians get out of poverty is by strengthening the safety net. But the governor failed to propose ways to strengthen cash assistance programs like refundable tax credits. Some of those are the California Earned Income Tax Credit, the Young Child Tax Credit, and the Foster Youth Tax Credit, which helps put cash back in the families of families with low incomes, CalWorks, which helps folks in deep poverty, and then SSI, SSP grants, which help older adults and people with disabilities. On the ECE front, the governor partially maintains funding for childcare spaces, but had previously committed to funding an additional 44,000 subsidized childcare spaces, and that commitment has been walked back indefinitely. There is no date for that to come back in the state budget. And the governor does propose upholding the terms of the Child Cares Provided Union contract, which provides a temporary increase in pay for child care providers who are unionized through the state, but there are still negotiations to ensure fair pay in the future. I'm going to pass it back to Monica. Also, quick aside and shout out for Monica. She is our housing and homelessness expert, so this section is her bread and butter. Yeah, so I'll kick it off to you.
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, not great news in the housing and homelessness front, though, as well, though. What I will say is that in this year's budget, it was also unfortunate to really see that there really is no meaningful state level investments for affordable housing. There are no general fund dollars that are really augmenting funds for affordable housing, even though we know that there's severe housing challenges that renters and low-income Californians continue to face. And it also fails to fund various critical and oversubscribed affordable housing programs within our state budget. And one thing I will note, at the end of last year, the governor and the legislature did undergo some additional negotiations to restructure our cap and invest dollars. But those are outside of our state general fund. And while there are some dollars for affordable housing there, they're not an intentional investment from the governor and the legislature. They're happening on their own and as a side. And even then, they're not enough to actually really meet the need of the amount of affordable housing that we need in the state. In terms of homelessness as well, there is no new or really augmented funding for homelessness aside what was promised last year for homelessness. And this is $500 million for the HAP program, which is a program that provides flexible dollars to local governments and service providers throughout the state. But this is effectively almost a 50% cut for homelessness funding statewide. And it's really alarming because besides this, there is no major state funding for homelessness services on top of all the federal threats that are coming down the line as the federal government is currently trying to restructure homelessness programs that will drastically reduce the amount of funding that can go towards long-term and even more interim solutions to homelessness. Within the budget, there's also various programs that are reduced or allowed to sunset for specific subpopulations, including families involved in the child welfare system, older adults, and people with disabilities as well. And then going into education, one bright spot of the budget was actually education funding that we saw. So Proposition 98 funding is substantially up, and that's Prop 98 determines how much money of our state budget has to go to education. And Prop 98 guarantees that minimal level of funding through K through 12 schools and community colleges, as well as state preschools. And the guarantee is actually estimated to be over $20 billion higher across our 3-year budget window than was projected last June. So the one bright spot here is that funding for schools is actually from our state budget, right? The local funds are kind of a separate issue, but it's actually looking stronger and relatively stable over the last couple of years, which is good news for our schools there. And this chart kind of shows the budget window, how much money was going towards schools through the Prop 98 guarantee. In terms of key K through 12 investments under the governor's plan, it does fully maintain funding transitional kindergarten or TK, including lower student to teacher ratios first implemented in the 2025 budget, and provides another $2 billion in Prop 98 funds for the California State Preschool Program. In terms of K through 12, there is $2.8 billion to sustain a discretionary block grant for student support and development. as well as $2 billion to support the COLA for the local control funding formula, and as well as $1 billion to sustain the community schools program, which is intended to be more of a holistic school model for children in California. And so now I'm transitioning a little bit out of what was in the proposed budget and what the legislature and the governor have already done. There have been some key actions already taken by our state leaders, predominantly in response to a lot of the federal threats that California is facing. So earlier this year, the governor approved some $90 million in one-time general fund for Planned Parenthood because I believe it was HR 1 or the federal government cut federal funding for Planned Parenthood. However, they cut funding for Planned Parenthood for only 1 year, so the additional state dollars are intended to keep Planned Parenthood in California afloat until hopefully the next federal fiscal year when they're able to receive funding again. And these funds are really critical because it helps ensure that clinics can keep their doors open and provide critical reproductive health services after HR 1 eliminated that funding. And then on the local level, Mauricio mentioned that we know that there's impacts from HR 1 coming to our California cities and counties. But what exactly does that look like? A recent report did come out trying to estimate how much money this will impact counties. And currently, HR 1 is anticipated to increase county annual costs by anywhere from $6 billion to $9.5 billion annually. And this is because of 4 main reasons. The first is providing indigent healthcare to people who lose Medi-Cal due to work reporting requirements and the other red tape requirements implemented by HR 1. And so when those folks have nowhere to go, counties still have to provide health services. And these are usually folks with the lowest incomes who are older adults, people with disabilities, or people experiencing homelessness that are really, or on the brink of experiencing homelessness who are really on the margins in California. This number is also reflecting the loss of public hospital system revenues due to reductions in federal support for Medicaid as well as increased workforce-related costs to actually implement and certify all these red tape and bureaucratic requirements that are being implemented from HR 1. And within our state budget too, there really isn't anything to help local governments to try to backfill some of these, huge dollars and huge cost increase that they will be facing due to HR 1. And because of that, right, we know that hospitals and food banks are likely to become overburdened, as many are already. And one thing to note is that although Proposition 1 back in 2024 was touted as potentially bringing more money for homelessness services, those dollars are specifically to serve folks experiencing homelessness with behavioral health conditions, and that pot of money is really tied up largely for existing efforts that county behavioral health departments already are administering. And now back to Mauricio for revenues.
All right, so we provided some context about where we're at. We did a deep dive on the governor's budget, and then covered the few actions that state leaders have taken so far. But we were talking about very little amounts of money in those previous slides. And we talked about the whole being a lot larger. So what can state policymakers need? At the Budget Center, we call for ongoing equitable revenue solutions. One, to address the harm of the federal cuts that we're seeing over the next several years, to protect those vital services, and then most importantly, to invest in the long-term well-being of Californians. We started the presentation talking about how much poverty there was in the state, and without ongoing revenue solutions, the state will not be able to make progress for its residents. And while it's going to take some time for us to get concrete data on the new federal tax cuts that went into effect in HR 1, we know that large profitable corporations have been given billions of dollars in federal tax breaks since the first Trump administration in 2017. And they're going to see even larger tax cuts under HR 1. And again, these are tax cuts and savings for corporations, but that's at the expense of healthcare and food assistance for Californians and Americans across the country. So what tools do state leaders have, and how can they raise revenues to make sure the state can continue to pay in these vital services? So first, state leaders can close a loophole that enables corporations to avoid paying $3 to $4 billion in state taxes each year. That loophole is known as a water's edge loophole and allows corporations to shift domestic profits overseas to tax havens that have very low or even zero corporate tax rates. And there's actually a bill moving through the legislature right now for this to happen. Another opportunity is to limit how much corporations can use tax credits and deductions to reduce their state tax bill. So right now, almost half of profitable corporations in the state only pay the minimum $800 tax. Like that's it. You can have millions of dollars in profits, but you can accrue so many tax credits and deductions that all you have to pay is $800 as a corporation in state tax. State leaders have periodically placed some temporary limits to these tax credits or deductions in times of significant budget crises, but we believe that the state can place reasonable ongoing limits on the annual use of tax credits and deductions. So large profitable corporations are for sure paying more than the minimum $800 tax. And then lastly, we think that the state can adjust tax rates to reflect corporate profit concentration by applying higher tax rates to higher profits, similar to the progressive tax structure that you and I have to pay when we pay our income taxes. So what's next in the state budget process? Right now, we're in that first bullet, which is February to early May. Budget subcommittee hearings are happening, which means the Assembly and the Senate are meeting and scrutinizing various portions of the governor's proposal that came out in January. During those subcommittee hearings, my colleagues have testified, offering our perspective. Advocates and community voices are also present to make sure that the legislator is hearing from its constituents. By May 14th, we'll see the governor's May revision, which is his revised spending plan. It's still not the official one. It's only a revised proposal. We anticipate it to include hopefully some adjustments based on some early feedback he's hearing from the legislator, but then we'll likely also have different revenue projections, especially if the market continues to be as rocky as it is because of the war in Iran. Late May to early June, the Senate and Assembly will reveal their unified legislative budget proposal, and that's what they use to pass it in June. And also use as a negotiation tool in late June when the governor and legislative leaders come together to reach the final budget deal. So a lot of dates on this screen. And then late June to early July is typically when this happens. The governor will sign the budget package, but he also has the opportunity to do line item vetoes. So if he agrees with like 99% of the budget package, he can sign it, but he could cross off that 1% of things that he may not agree with and does not want to see in the final budget package. So that's where things stand. We'll jump to Q&A in a second, but want to do a plug for all of the resources we have. So if you visit our website at calbudgetcenter.org, we have our first look analysis pinned right on our homepage. It's an in-depth analysis of the governor's proposal, so everything that we shared right now, but with a lot more details and links to other items. We also have a conference happening next month right here in Sacramento. You could find the speakers, agenda, and all of that on our website as well. And if you want to learn all about the state budget process, you can visit budgetacademy.org. And that's your one-stop shop. There's videos, glossaries, guides, and everything you need to know about how the state budget works and how you could get involved and make your voice heard. And with that, I think we're in Q&A.
I think Tish's camera is there she is. Okay.
Hi. Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Monica and Mauricio. It was really informative, really accessible and easy to understand. Yeah, just if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. I'm the Treasurer Secretary of HPPA. And yeah, just here to moderate Q&A. That was really awesome.
I do see 2 questions, Ms. Tish.
Do you? I don't, in the chat?
In the Q&A. I
Oh.
see 3 questions. Would you like me to step in and call them out?
Sorry. Cool. So from Rhiannon, are tax credits considered the same as tax loopholes? Who wants to take that? Yeah.
I can take this one, Monica, if that's fine. I would say so. It comes down to semantics in many cases. We sometimes call some of the tax loopholes as some of the legal tax credits and deductions that are available for corporations, and that have been many times designed between corporations and policymakers as a way to help them avoid taxes. And I can drop one of our resources in the chat that shows it's obviously a legal tax credit, but it's showing that Alphabet, which is a parent company of Google, Apple, Nvidia, Salesforce, have billions of dollars in tax credits available to keep reducing their corporate profit, their state tax liability. So I put that in the chat if you want to take a look. Monica, do you want to add to that?
Erin, never mind. I think the Q&A disappeared, so I think that it's been answered. Did Monica want to speak to that a little bit more, or do you want to move on to the next question?
We can go on to the next question. I haven't pulled up, so it's the one about disparities. Are we going to go to that one next?
Yeah, so that is, what is the California Budget and Policy Center doing to address the disparities that are shown currently in the 26-27 budget?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So a lot of our work is really rooted in highlighting the disparities that still remain in California and the disparities that our state budget and the lack of funding for certain programs are exacerbating. So we work a lot with advocates across a variety of issue areas to really highlight why we need more funding, who's being affected if we don't fund things, but also what are the wins from funding things like homelessness services and affordable housing to really show that we're closing the gap. But for a lot of these things, whether it's from homelessness and affordable housing to childcare and education, it requires ongoing dollars. And so a good chunk of our work is really building the case year after year to continue pushing policymakers and legislators to continue investing in the programs and systems that we know are working, but are funded and adequately resourced to get us to a California that we see really a significant reduction in disparities across the board. And Mauricio, if you wanted to add.
And you guys are doing an excellent job at that. Because I love your focus is very much on disparities. So, and then second to last question here is, what can be done to increase corporate contributions to state funding? If taxes are increased, how likely would they leave the state, and how might that affect the budget?
Yeah, so I can start with your first question. That's something that we put on one of the close to the end of one of the slides. But eliminating the Water's Edge election, which would help ensure that domestic companies can't use tax havens to avoid paying state taxes, putting reasonable limits on tax credits and deductions for corporations. And then to that latter question, if that would cause corporations to leave the state, California only taxes a portion of a corporation's profits that based on the business that occurs in the state. So a business who moves their headquarters or facilities outside of the state would still have to pay California taxes on the share of profits it makes in the state. And California has, it's the 4th largest economy in the world. So we don't anticipate a corporation who moves their headquarters to stop operating and conducting business in the state. So many times companies are not seeing significant tax savings because they're still conducting business within the state.
Yeah, and That's a great point. And the one thing I will add too is that unfortunately there's a lot of misconceptions on how much corporations are actually taxed, right? California, we're not like the highest, we're not the state with the highest state corporate tax rate, even though, in the zeitgeist, it seems like that. There's other states that tax more than we do. And also that to say, like, because our corporate tax is pretty modest in the grand scheme of things, and there's a lot of tax loopholes and ways to get around it, the largest and most profitable corporations in California, what they pay in state taxes is literally 0.1% of their total expenditures. It's minuscule. And so it's a lot of narrative work, and but like we as a budget center are also working towards to educate and really telling the true story behind taxes, especially corporate taxes, because there is unfortunately a lot of misinformation out there and just kind of the general spiel of things because of how powerful corporations are in, quite frankly, in California and really statewide or nationwide.
Great points, you two. I think we find a lot of people in the corporate world and the business community that are willing or pro paying more taxes too. So there just might be some misalignment there. This next question is just from Ryan. It says, can I ask verbally? I don't know if audience has access to.
Let me go ahead and unmute him. Give me 1 minute, see if I can do this.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm on my phone and it's a little hard to type. So thank you for the accommodation. The state auditor put out a report last August that the state's return to work policies that they were considering and staved off with labor negotiations last year to revisit it again this year. The state auditor estimated $225 million annually. So over 4 to 5 years, that's $1 billion in additional costs. So I'm just curious if, decisions like that, how they play into maybe the larger budget priorities, right? I mean, that's not new revenue that would come with that. That's on the spending side. So I'm just curious if your organization has looked at that at all, has any insights into any of that. Thank you.
So I was just looking at this bill. It's one of the bills that I've been analyzing recently at work, but basically this one of the pros for promoting telework, like state workers working from home predominantly or for the majority of the time, it leads to a $225 million in savings for the state. So I think the question is, like, have we looked at innovative solutions for funding? Like, if most people want to say no, we want state workers in the downtown. It fuels the local businesses. But if we do have a workforce state workforce that works from home, like $225 million is the savings there. So I think that's what the question was.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, but I don't think that's a portion of the state budget that we look into most of the time. And I know we haven't this time around.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, I think that's and I appreciate like Tish's point of maybe it's like a narrative point too, but that is not an area that we focus on at the Budget Center. But I think it just raises a broader question though, right? It's like, where are state dollars going? Like, even knowing that, and if there is, a solution that you think like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be spending money on this, we should be trying to spend money on healthcare and food assistance, like what are your priorities and your input? That's why it's also really important to bring it up to the legislature.
Yeah, but that's a really interesting thought and creative solution, Ryan. Okay, this last question is from Mandeep. How will the upcoming billionaires tax play a role in the budget, if any? Understanding it will be retrospectively taxed from January 1, 2026, if it were to be passed. The upcoming billionaires tax play, the billionaires tax. What do you guys think about the billionaires tax conversation?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it would have a really significant impact on the state budget should it pass. We haven't done a robust analysis on it yet because we don't know if it's qualified for the ballot, but we are tracking the development closely. We know there's strong rationale for taxing wealth, and we'll look into it should it qualify for the ballot. And we should find out this summer or in the coming months.
By
Yeah.
June 25th, I believe, we'll find out what officially qualifies for the ballot. And there's a ton of measures, I think, to your point, and other ones that could have pretty large impacts on our state budget as well. So we are tracking a lot of the ballot initiatives that are moving through the process currently.
You should expect analysis from us late July, early August on a whole slew of ballot initiatives. Once, we know what's on there and we're able to do some analysis.
These are great questions, guys. Oh, there's another one. Okay, no, this is just for reference. There's the $225 million in increased cost annually. That savings I mentioned for the state. There's some additional information there in the link that Ryan shared. Anyone else? These are great questions. I think that's it. Sylvia, back to you.
Okay. Well, then, if there are no other questions, I want to, on behalf of the board, the Hornets Policy and Politics Alumni chapter, want to thank you for joining us, for registering, for following us. One announcement. Part 2 of this Lunch and Learn series will take place April 1st. Please register to it. That is going to be a little bit different. That is going to be a panel discussion between the two branches that the center just mentioned. We're going to have the LAO, which is the budget branch of the legislature. And then we're going to have Department of Finance, which is the budget arm of the governor. Both are going to be sitting in a single forum, answering really what is the California budget's priorities as reflected in the current proposed budget. So don't miss it. Go and register right now. And then we will see you back here April 1st, 2026 at lunchtime. Have a wonderful day.